yesterday our jargon term was mastery, and I was talking about it a little bit but it's a very elusive, slippery little thing, mastery, right? And mastery criteria. Sure. Because I want you to give me a slide rule and, have it be an if P then Q, but it's not so much that. This is part of the creative art of doing ABA, right? It's determining mastery?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think the most important thing to remember with mastery is that a child hasn't mastered something unless they can do it with new situations, new people, and, different environments and so on and so forth. If they're not at that level, then it isn't even mastered anyways. You don't want to just be mastering rote responses to certain picture cards or to certain situations that you set up and you go, oh, look, they mastered this one. Of course, we're going to mark that as mastered, but keep going with a skill and keep introducing more and more targets and examples under all different kinds of lots of situations until you can introduce a new situation and they can just do it without you having to teach them. So they need to show basically that they're having generalization before they can even be completely mastered with something.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. So that was going to be my next question. So if we're saying, because mastery is, I always think of it as saying, okay, well, the child, by George, he's got it, that kind of thing. But then generalization is when they can apply it in all those other situations. So what I'm hearing you saying now is that really you haven't mastered it until you've reached generalization.
Yeah, I mean, each item that you introduce, we're going to measure it, and we're going to, have some criterion in place. Like a standard one a lot of people use will be once the child can do this 80 to 100% correct across 2 to 3 sessions, let's say, right? And so let's say we're teaching them to, identify some emotion or something like that, and they can do that, and they meet that criterion. So we say, okay, they've mastered identifying happy.
Yeah.
Okay? So then now we go and we introduce, other happy examples, different people and different cards and things, and we get to the point now where we can bring up any new happy in a person or in a picture, and they can now just say happy without you having to even tell them anymore. Okay. If you don't have to actually go through the teaching phase, then you've really mastered happy. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Then we're going to introduce, alongside all of this, we're going to be introducing other emotions too. I'm not saying like they have to have generalization with happy before you can go to sad or anything like that.
Right.
You can work on a lot of these things simultaneously. But but the whole process is they don't have like identifying emotions really truly mastered until they've reach that criterion. Like I said, maybe it's 80 to 100% correct across a couple sessions with each of the ones you've introduced, and they're doing it completely at that level with new targets that you introduce, and they're doing it for the whole concept. So now it's like all the emotions that matter for this child.
Yeah.
They can do it with. So now emotions completely is mastered.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I'm going to break it down a little bit with your help.
Okay.
Because for people who are new to ABA and this concept of teaching in this way, you're looking at your child and your child has no idea when you're happy or sad or whatever, and they have no idea when they're happy or sad, and it just seems overwhelming. Like, why didn't my child just get it?
Right.
My nephew got it. Why didn't my child just get that? Why do I have to go and teach it? And it seems overwhelming as a parent. But the one thing that was so interesting to me as a parent is that you guys really have this, stepping stone thing that first we're going to teach this, and then we're going to teach this, and then we're going to teach this. And at some point, the child gets it in the way that the neurotypical nephew that you're going, why didn't my child get it that way? Yeah. So I do want to point out that for people who are listening to us talking about this, that you think, what are you talking about? Why would you do that? It's for every frustrating moment that you looked at your child and said, I don't understand why my child doesn't get this. Okay. And you feel overwhelmed and think, I have no idea then. If they didn't just get it, how do I go and teach this? And as you teach it, because there's so many things to teach, you have to know when to move on to the next thing.
Right. Okay. So
and that's where the mastery comes in, right?
Yeah, that would be like, if we're going to stick with this emotions example.
Yeah.
Let's say you're introducing an emotion, happy, and you are working on it with the child, and you have a mastery criterion in place of, let's talk about the mastery criterion. Yeah. It can vary. It doesn't have to be the same, and it depends on the child.
And we should say, for those who didn't watch yesterday's show, the mastery criteria is, it's like a guideline of figuring out if the child has this skill, right? Yeah, so it is an art like everything else. You have to be flexible and figure out what do you need to require of this particular child, because they're all individuals and they all do different things. Some children, 80 to 100% across 2 sessions is enough. Yeah. And they really get it and they never regress. So you're going to track
if they regress, because after something's mastered, you don't just never work on it ever again and just assume it's still mastered. It goes into what we call maintenance phase, where we still test it, like maybe, at first maybe twice a week or 3 times a week, and if they're still doing well with that, then we might reduce down to once a week and things like that, right?
Yeah.
Until we just are testing once in a while. If you show regression and a child loses a skill, you might start to question your mastery criteria and say, you know what, 80 to 100 is not good enough for this child. It has to be 90 to 100. Or you might even have a child where you realize across 2 sessions is not good enough, but it should be across 3 sessions.
Right.
Or you might even have a child where they respond incorrectly always on the very first sitting. So I sit down and I bring out my happy emotion and I ask, how is this person feeling? And the child gets it wrong.
Right.
And so then I prompt and provide assistance to them to learn the response that's correct that I want. And then they give me the correct response. And then now let's say I come back and I do that later on in the session and now they get it right. And they get it right for all the rest of the time. So let's say I do that 10 times. They got the first one wrong and they got the next 9 correct.
Right. That's 90% of the time. So it fits the criteria.
Right. But then let's say that's day 1.
Right.
And then day 2 I come in and I bring out my happy stuff and the kid gets it wrong on the first one again.
Yeah.
And then they get all 9 right. But they always do this pattern where they get the first one wrong. Interesting. This is a really good kid with picking up on my prompts.
Right.
They picked up on what it was I'm asking for. They're not attending to the real stimuli that matter.
Right.
They're just picking up on what does she want from me.
Right.
This is what she's telling me she
Jem would do
wants.
this a lot, by the way. He was guilty of this. He's like, what do you want so that I can get my reward? But he wasn't really getting it.
Yeah,
he
so
just had good, really, paying attention in the moment and good short-term memory.
Yeah, so that card right there that looks like that, if I touch it, she gives me something good.
Yeah.
I don't actually, it sounds like wah, wah, wah.
Exactly. It's the peanut thing. Wah, 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 wah.
So,
right.
So anyways, we go, oh, wow, okay, so this is the type of child who needs some other thing added to their mastery criterion, which is first trial must always be correct.
Right.
In that formula of 80 to 100 or 90 to 100%.
Yeah.
And you have to do that sometimes with certain kids, but the truth is that we always get to this level where we're randomly rotating whatever it is that's the target. So if happy is my target, I'm going to not just do happy, happy, happy for 10 trials.
Right.
And get that rote responding. I'm going to bring in other things like that they already know, that they've mastered as well, and things like that. But still, sometimes they'll pick up on, this is that one thing that was kind of different that I don't already know or whatever, and she wants me to do this when I, you know what I mean? So
they can be tricky. I mean, they're smart in their own way, and they try to outsmart us teaching them sometimes, right? Because let's remember that the whole point is that they're working and learning to get the reinforcement. Yeah. That is their motivation, not learning. We're trying to trick them into learning, and sometimes they just try to trick us into giving the reinforcement. It's okay. It's a sign of intelligence.
Here's the thing. They're always right. Just
yes,
so you know.
And you guys say that, and as a parent, I try to acknowledge that.
The learner is always right. The learner is always right because they're only doing what we're teaching them.
Right.
And we're the ones setting up situations that end up being a little too rote or whatever that end up in that problem. Or we're the ones that are not, tailoring the mastery criteria properly. So people need to think outside the box. Don't get stuck in like a mastery criterion that I read in a book said.
Right.
80 to 100% across 2 sessions and then just be done with it. A lot of kids need more than 2 sessions. Some kids need 90. Some kids need that first trial.
Right.
So
and some tasks need more than that. We were talking yesterday because our topic this week is safety, that 80% criteria is not going to cut it for safety. Like we can't, I marvel at the idea that, well, I could settle for 80% of the time my son knows how to cross the street, but the other 20% of the time he doesn't. That won't work. So it really is this very flexible thing that you have to be creative with. And it really is only there to signal, when you want to move on to the next thing, and if the criteria isn't working, doesn't match, then you change the criteria. And
guess how you know if it's working?
How do you know when it's working?
You collect data. People don't want to do it. It's a lot of work.
There it is.
But listen, if you don't and you go with your gut, it's not going to be right. You're subjective. And you're going to say, like, I think he got a lot of those right. He's doing good. We're done with it or something, Not going to work. You've got to collect the data and you've got to, get used to making little graphs and putting these dots on there and seeing them going up to 100 or 90 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
and going, okay, awesome, he's done with that one, now I'm introducing the next. And it's really necessary also just to show progress, and for funding agencies, they need to see that stuff.
And so that you see, because as you pointed out, if you weren't graphing, you could keep teaching and being frustrated and frustrate the child and not realize that pattern of, oh, well, they managed to get the first time wrong every time, but the rest of them they get right.
And they keep progressing, and I don't know why. Right. They just keep losing this skill. They never really had it to begin with.
And if the goal is to be effective and to be efficient, then you have to get used to the idea that you're going to graph things and that you're going to take really good data. Now, I will say this, that one of the things that we learned early on is that your data is only as good as the person who is the least good at taking the data. Right?
Yeah.
And I was very fortunate because I had therapists coming to my home from the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, so they were taking data. There were only a few times that it was required of me as a parent to take data in the hours, like I had to take data on when he went to the bathroom and the diaper before we started doing the toileting. I had to take data if he was engaging in a challenging behavior that we asked to be targeted. But 90% of the time, it was not my responsibility to take data. I was working on more of the, upholding the consequences. But for those of you who are having to go this at least in part or in full on your own, you're really going to have to make peace with it. And I used to say always, I don't want to be the weakest person on the team. And the data is a big part of being on the team.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Those of you who...
There's a whole group of people who do what's called cold probe data. Have you heard of it?
No. It sounds horrible. sounds like a really terrible medical procedure. What a horrible name for something. Already I'm scared.
It's basically based off this idea that I don't want to spend all my time collecting data. I really want to know if the child knows this or not. And I'm going to come in, and my very first time I ask them during the session, I'm going to collect data only on that one time.
Oh.
And I'm not going to do it on any others because it's cold. Meaning like you haven't worked on it yet.
Right.
And it's kind of like a probe or whatever. And that kind of gets at those kids who always maybe get the first one wrong, and then you prompt and then they get them all right. And so it gets rid of that problem.
Yeah.
And it's like the first one of the day, which they haven't had any practice since yesterday or whatever, is your hardest one anyways. And so it's kind of a little bit of a conservative measure in that way. But it's kind of also doesn't seem like it really matches what we do in behavior analysis, because we always, collect data on everything and stuff like that. But there's been some research on it, and so far the research studies are showing there isn't a huge difference at all between the two methods. So some people who just don't have the time, that's one thing they can consider.
Okay, something to think about. Okay, and so when you're thinking about changing the criteria, we've already talked about some of the different things you can consider changing. You can consider across how many sessions you're doing it, across how many people. What are some other things that you might change in the math?
You might even do across how many days, because sometimes a child has like 3, maybe even 4 sessions in one day.
Yeah.
And so if your mastery criterion is they have to do it like 80 to 100% across 3 sessions, then they might be able to get that done in one day.
Yeah.
And some kids just can't have that. They need to have at least like another day or something.
And I would think the flip would be also, because sometimes they just don't have the opportunity to do something very often. They may have it, but they haven't met the mastery criteria because they hadn't had the opportunity to do it that many days in a row.
True.
So very important, though, that you know what the mastery criteria is, and that you not think of it as this really stationary, written in stone
The other thing some people will say is like you want to have it mastered. That percentage that you need to have also can't just be always in the same setting and with the same person.
Okay.
So like across at least 2 settings and across at least 2 people or something like that.
Okay. Great.
Right? Because kids get stuck where they literally learn, like, what does Adele want from me today?
Right.
What does Shannon want from me today?
Yes.
And
what can I get away with
we need to make sure
Mom?
that this will work with different people.
Yes.
And when they go, oh, we're doing it at that table, and I notice whenever we're at that table, I'm doing this thing or whatever. They're just really smart to pick up on those things.
They really are smart to pick up on a lot of different things.